Night settles lightly over the rounded hills of southeastern Africa, where granite breathes out stored warmth and shadows glide softly. Wind moves like a quiet pulse across fitted stone without mortar, touching curved walls and slipping onward into darkness beyond. Far below, fires dim to embers, cattle breathe in steady rhythm, and a last wooden pestle meets grain once more. They call this place Zimbabwe, the houses of stone, a name carried softly through generations before the wider world learned another title. Built and renewed between the 11th and 15th centuries by Shona-speaking communities, the city rose without haste, shaped by hands that trusted measure, balance, and the patience of stacked granite. No single tower dominates the skyline. Instead, walls curve like slow water, guiding movement rather than commanding it, inviting the body to drift instead of hurry. Here, power rests quietly in enclosure, pathway, threshold, and return. From a distance, the city reads as rings of stone drawn upon grass. The hill complex rises first, dark and watchful, while below it the valley ruins open into gentler courtyards of daily life, and between them the great enclosing wall curves in a vast, elliptical hush. At night, the passages narrow into ribbons of shadow and open suddenly into wide courts, where starlight rests on stone like water in a bowl, still enough to hold a reflection of passing clouds. Nothing calls attention. Everything simply remains, breathing with land. Imagine resting on a flat slab along the slope, the stone cool beneath your back, the sky wide above your closed eyes. Below you, the curved walls hold the night without tension, and the whole settlement exhales in long, even intervals that do not ask for listening yet are impossible to ignore. There is no trumpet of power here, no clamor of command, only the gentle accounting of breath, fire, cattle, grain, and sleep, arranged into a rhythm that teaches the body how to slow without instruction. Stone keeps time. This story walks without hurry through the houses of stone, following wind through passageways, light across thresholds, and footsteps that leave no mark. It does not seek crowns, battles, or proclamations, only the way a city once learned to live with its ground and sky in steady agreement. If you wish, let your eyes rest now and allow the night to thin at its own pace. We will begin with a morning that arrives by degrees, when the first sunlight slides between stones and remembers where the paths once turned. Morning in the Stone Valley. Morning arrives without haste in the Stone Valley below, light thinning across granite before touching the rounded thatched roofs nested in the hollow. Smoke lifts in threads from cooking fires and braids with lingering mist above damp grass. Shadows retreat slowly along curved walls, and the air carries cool clarity shaped by night. Nothing announces the day with urgency. It simply opens, layer by layer, like breath returning to a resting chest. The valley does not wake so much as continue, shifting from dark to pale with practiced ease that feels older than memory. Even sound waits its turn here, choosing moments carefully, allowing small motions to complete their gentle arcs before another begins to speak in the cool air. In the valley ruins, the morning begins with the smallest of voices, a wooden spoon circling grain inside a clay pot, a child's laugh slipping between footsteps, the padded sound of bare feet crossing packed earth. A woman carries a small stone mortar toward a wall, warmed by early light, and settles into the steady work of grinding maize and millet. The sound is low and regular, a distant rain that never arrives. Nearby, a man adjusts the leather of a cattle tether, calm hands moving with familiar knowledge as warm breath rises from patient animals. Cattle are wealth here, patience given form, and their slow presence anchors the morning to what must be tended without haste or display today. Children chase one another across the shadowed court, weaving between curves of stone with breathless certainty. They know nothing of distant caravan routes, nothing of gold or ivory carried toward a far salt horizon. Their world is simpler and complete, bounded by high stone, round earth, the smell of smoke, and the low calling of cattle from woven pens. The walls give back their voices in softened echoes, teaching them space without instruction. The valley holds them the way a bowl holds rain, without asking why. They run until warmth rises in their chests and dust lifts briefly, then settles again as if nothing had ever disturbed the ground. Laughter arrives, stays, fades, and leaves the court unchanged at hour. Across another court, a stoneworker sits among granite blocks, turning each one slowly, as if listening for its balance. He selects edges that meet with quiet trust, taps, adjusts, rotates, and sets again until weight answers weight. The walls here rise without mortar, stone upon stone, guided only by skill, memory, and the sense trained into palms by years of patient making. Each fitted piece carries the mark of attention rather than force. The wall grows without sound, a line of thought made solid. He works not for spectacle but for endurance, knowing that balance once found will endure sun, rain, and the passing of uncounted footsteps. The stone answers by remaining where it is set, long after hands lift. Along the narrow passage between two curving walls, a line of women walks unhurried, water gourds balanced on their heads. Metal bracelets meet with soft, bright taps at each step, a traveling rhythm that keeps time with breath. Their voices move in slow sentences, rising, settling, pausing to look across distant fields where mist still rests on soil. They carry the morning forward without lifting it from the ground, and the stone corridors hold their movement like water in a channel. Nothing pulls them faster than their own pace, and nothing behind them demands return before they are ready to complete it. The path curves, opens, narrows again, and the day follows. The same unforced design, without command or resistance. The city wakes as a whole without gathering into a crowd. Sound arrives, lingers, and departs, leaving behind spaces that feel intentionally kept. A cough echoes once and is finished. A pot lid lifts, rings, and rests again. Even the birds pause between calls, as if respecting the way the valley measures morning. This restraint is not rule but habit, carried through generations that learned how easily noise can outrun meaning when left unchecked. Here the hours do not press against one another but rest, like stones set with space enough to breathe between their weight. The sun continues its climb, yet the city grants it permission to move slowly. Light crosses walls by fractions, never by leaps at hour. If you listen closely, you can feel time loosen its grip. The measure here is not the cleft of shadow on stone, but the way warmth gathers in surfaces and releases again. The sun does rise, of course, but it seems to do so with permission from every wall it touches, asking whether the city is ready for the next degree of brightness. Nothing is hurried and nothing is delayed. The morning simply arrives at the speed of attention. The valley accepts this pace without comment, shaped to receive slowness as readily as it receives light. Even the dust waits before lifting, as if given instruction by air to move only when invited. Nothing compels it beyond circle of heat. From the outer courts, the smell of grain cooking drifts inward, meeting the cooler scent of stone that never fully leaves. These two odors braid through passageways and settle into clothing, skin, and memory. A goat coughs softly in a pen. A child trips, rises, and runs on without ceremony. The life of the valley does not rise in scenes, but in continuities, one small motion carrying the next without interruption. The morning is not made of events, but of endurance, shaped into gentle sequence, a chain that never announces its links. Step follows step across earth pressed firm by years of returning feet. The ground remembers each weight and answers with steady silence. This is how quiet becomes structure. The valley ruin does not announce its importance. It does not seek eyes or long attention. It simply persists as a platform for the ordinary, which here is complete enough to carry a city. Walls bend to guide wind. Courtyards open to receive light. Narrow paths teach the body how to turn without decision. Everything does its work without interpretation, and by doing so teaches how a place can think. This thinking is not spoken but built into curve, thickness, and meeting line, a knowledge that remains even when voices fall away. The city holds its understanding the way stone holds warmth, quietly and for longer than expected. In this persistence, the morning finds its depth. Without insistence, without display. Stay here a little longer and feel how the light advances by degrees no clock would bother to mark. It slides along stacked granite, pauses at the curve of a wall, gathers briefly in the dust of a courtyard, then continues on as if guided by patience rather than force. The city allows this kind of travel. It does not hurry the sun any more than it hurries those who live within its lines. You may feel your own breath begin to match this tempo, lengthening without instruction, finding space between its movements. The valley offers no lesson, yet the body learns all the same. As the sun climbs, the morning accepts you without question. You are here, it continues. The hill that watches the city. Morning on the hill carries a different rhythm, quieter and broader, shaped by wind and distance rather than by hearth fire and narrow walls. From the upper terraces, the air feels lighter, moving without obstruction, touching stone and skin with equal patience. The valley below gathers its sounds and releases them upward as a softened hum. Here on the heights, the day does not begin with action, but with looking. Light arrives first on the stone floors, spreads across curved walls, and only later descends into the clustered roofs below. Everything feels held in suspension, as though the hill were pausing before answering the valley's awakening call. From a paved court near the edge, you can look across the entire settlement. The round roofs appear like quiet shells scattered across the earth, connected by thin soil paths that twist gently toward distant grazing lands. Beyond them, faint ridges lift in slow layers, carrying other villages, other fires, other voices that speak languages close enough to recognize one another without effort. The distance does not feel empty, it feels shared. Even what cannot be clearly seen remains present as suggestion, as quiet companionship across land shaped by movement more than by boundary. The hill does not separate, it gathers. An older man steps toward the edge of the terrace, his cloak wrapped loosely against the steady breeze. He leans into the wall as if it were a familiar shoulder. These stones are not symbols to him. They are chapters of memory set into curves and thickness. He recalls when one section rose higher to meet a growing family, when another wall curved wider to make space for grain and cattle and sleep. Each change followed life's quiet expansion, not declaration. To him, the city is not finished or ancient, but simply ongoing, a surface that continues to be adjusted by living hands. Nearby, a small group of youths carries bundles of firewood, dried maize, and woven grass toward the hilltop stores. They follow the stone paths without speaking, their feet finding the familiar rises and dips without thought. From this height, the everyday objects they carry reduce into moving colors against gray ground. Baskets, blankets, and tools become small living marks drifting across a still page. Nothing about their work is urgent. The repetition itself provides its reason. Up and down they go, transferring weight from valley to hill, from growth to keeping, without making sound large enough to disturb the balance of the place. In another corner of the court, a young woman lifts woven cloth onto low stone ledges to dry. The fabric holds earth colors only, browns, soft golds, and deep umbers that echo the ground itself. Wind moves the cloth with light fingers, raising and lowering the edges as though testing their readiness to become garments again. These private banners signal nothing outward. They speak only to the sun and air of the hill. Everything here participates in exposure and release. Nothing hides, but nothing announces itself either. The cloth dries because the wind passes, and the wind passes because it always has. Sound on the hill remains sparse. The wind whispers through narrow wall gaps. Footsteps shift stone dust. Far below, cattle answer one another with slow breaths that roll upward as soft thunder. Even the distant pounding of grain reaches this height as a muted pulse, rounded by space into something more like heartbeat than labor. The hill listens without gathering sound into noise. Nothing rises above the rest. Everything stays level, flowing as one quiet field of motion that does not peak or fall, but simply continues. The hill keeps sound as stone keeps warmth, receiving and releasing without commentary. Those who study the ruins today believe the hill once held the political and spiritual heart of the settlement, the residence of leaders while most lived below. Yet in this slow telling, such divisions fade. Here they appear only as neighbors who rise earlier into stronger wind, who store grain on higher ground, who look outward more often, not because authority demands it, but because the land invites it. Fires are lit here the same way. Food is prepared here the same way. Cloth is washed and dried here the same way, under the same patient sky that bends equally over hill and valley. Standing at the edge of the court with eyes closed, you can hear the city without individual sounds separating themselves. Footsteps, voices, cattle, grinding stones, wind and fire merge into a single woven background. Nothing tries to lead. Nothing tries to follow. All sound travels together like water, moving through shallow channels that never deepen enough to become force. The hill does not dominate the valley through sight or height. It participates by maintaining this shared quiet. The city becomes a continuous murmur that flows not through ears only, but through chest and breath and balance. Life on the hill feels slightly ahead of the valley and slightly behind it, At the same time, the wind reaches here first, but the warmth lingers longer below. Work begins earlier here, yet ends with the valley's dusk. These differences create no tension. They form a slow exchange, a conversation between up and down that requires no speaking. Grain moves upward, sound moves downward. Smoke drifts both ways. The hill gives storage, and the valley gives motion. Together they make a system that holds without locking anything into place too tightly. From the hilltop, the sun appears to move almost sideways rather than upward, sliding along the horizon before lifting fully into view. Light approaches the valley gradually, as though it must pass through the hills quiet first. Stone warms in shallow waves. Shadows shorten with no sharp edges. Even the sky seems broader here, containing more air than below. Distance stretches differently on the hill. Time stretches with it. What takes an hour in the valley seems to require only a breath here, while a single moment of looking can unfold like an entire morning when allowed to remain unmeasured. The hill does not instruct. It only offers vantage. Those who move along its edges do not carry themselves differently, only more slowly. Their bodies adjust to exposure and wind, to longer sight lines and fewer walls. Nothing compels them to hold this view. They simply do because the stone remains beneath their hands and the valley remains beneath their eyes. Routine forgets itself more easily up here. Movement becomes observation. Observation becomes rest. The hill teaches not by meaning, but by allowing stillness to feel wide enough to contain the whole city at once. When you remain on the hill long enough, the difference between above and below dissolves. The city's many small activities compress into a single quiet presence. No sound climbs sharply enough to break the shape the hill holds. No motion becomes fast enough to escape the slow net of wind and stone. The hill watches not as a guardian, but as a witness that neither intervenes nor withdraws. It simply remains where it has always been, allowing life to arrange itself beneath. In that permission, the city continues without needing to be directed, and the hill continues without needing to be named. The walls that learn to breathe. The walls that learn to breathe awaken as the sun climbs higher, throwing slanted light across every curve and seam. Stone reveals itself in layers, each course resting on patience. The city shows its craft without explanation. Passages, enclosures, and winding corridors rising without mortar, held only by weight, balance, and generations of careful hands. From a distance it all appears still, yet at close range the walls shimmer with movement as shadows slide and light shifts. They are surfaces that answer the day slowly, receiving heat without urgency and releasing it with calm. Nothing here feels hurried, not even the stone that rises meter by patient meter. Time settles into the joints and does not ask to be counted. At the foot of a wall, a young stone worker continues his task, choosing each piece by sound rather than by sight. He taps gently and waits for the reply hidden inside the granite. A full note means strength and belonging. A hollow tone sends the stone aside for quieter work. He does this without haste. The wall has stood longer than his name, and it will likely stand after his hands are gone. Work, therefore, borrows its rhythm from permanence. Nothing presses him forward except the simple desire to place one stone well before the light shifts. Even effort here feels like listening rather than shaping, like answering a question that was already being asked by time itself. He smiles. Stories move through the city like slow wind, passed from older mouths into younger memory. The stoneworker remembers how elders spoke of the first widening of the walls, of nights when fires burned close against fresh stone, warming hands that laid new courses into the body of the city. No one named a date. Time arrived instead as a feeling of before and after. Now those layers remain as touchable memory. You can trace the decision of another life in each slight change of curve. The wall keeps these quiet choices without commentary. It simply holds them and continues to receive new hands, new seasons, new shadows, sliding over what has never finished becoming. The past still practices its patience. Walking beside the walls, you notice how often they curve without necessity. A passage continues though it encloses no house and guards no threshold. The line simply turns because it wishes to turn. Some sections carry patterns made only for looking, small chevrons, diagonal rhythms that catch light and release it again. These are not instructions, they are gestures left behind by hands that enjoyed their own movement. Architecture here does not command, it converses. The wall bends the way a body shifts while listening. It yields slightly and holds completely, never rigid, never loose. Movement becomes frozen breath. Breath becomes frozen movement. The city rests inside that cycle without needing to decide which comes first. Stone accepts both equally. If you lean your back against the wall at noon, you feel the stored warmth travel through cloth and skin slowly, like a held memory returning. Stone takes the sun without resistance and returns it later without asking. In this quiet exchange between heat and release, the wall learns to breathe with the people who move beside it. Midday busyness warms both bodies and stone alike. Evening gathers them again around small fires, the warmth not gone but moved, softened, shared. This breathing has no words. It does not need to be understood. It simply continues, as steady as the cattle slow their steps home, as steady as the sky lowering its light without drama. The wall exhales gently too. Children treat these passages not as wonder but as territory. They run between curves, counting steps from shadow to shadow, testing how far a voice can travel before it bends out of hearing. Small stones slip into wall gaps and return days later as unchanged as the placing hand. For them, this architecture is not monument but passage, not legacy but play. The city becomes a field of corners and discoveries that do not demand reverence. Everything here invites motion without speed, curiosity without conquest. In their games, the scale of the city shrinks kindly, entering hand size and breath size. The walls answer them by staying exactly what they are: firm, warm, and patient, to be climbed by laughter alone. If you follow them without trying to keep time, you feel your own breathing begin to round. Each turn of the wall delays the world just long enough to soften it. Shade arrives without warning and leaves without farewell. Small openings frame distant fields for only a moment before they close again into curve. The body adjusts its pace without argument. Muscles release their hurry, not because they are told to rest, but because they forget the meaning of rushing. The heart listens to the architecture and matches its slower oval. Motion becomes continuous rather than directional. You do not arrive anywhere. You remain inside more gently than before. The walls guide without leading. Breath follows curve and finds hole again. The great enclosure's wide ellipse is the largest of these rounded gestures, yet it does not overwhelm. The openness within it feels held rather than exposed. Sound gathers here and stays low. Light enters slowly and leaves leaves without edge. It is a space that teaches the body how to remain without tension. The child becomes quiet here without being asked. The adult sets thought down without instruction. Nothing compels reverence. The space simply allows weight to slide off. Even the sun lowers its intensity as it moves across the floor. Attention widens rather than sharpens. The enclosure does not contain an answer. It holds a pause long enough for the body to remember its own quiet center. Stillness stands upright. To move through this architecture is to practice a different kind of living, one that permits delay as part of form. Walls do not hurry those who touch them. They accept slow handling and return it with depth. When evening comes, the stone begins its gentle exchange of warmth for shadow. Heat seeps back into moving air and lowers the posture of those seated nearby. The wall does not speak, yet it answers the body with release. This is the breathing that never makes a sound, large enough to be called voice. It belongs instead to the category of things that only happen when no one demands they be heard. The city learns this quietly every day and forgets nothing. If you let yourself wander with no destination between these breathing walls long enough, your attention loosens from edges. The architecture no longer surrounds you. It carries you the way current carries leaves between banks that never fully close. Children pass, and their laughter leaves no echo that does not settle into stone. A worker lifts another chosen piece and sets it down without strain. Warmth slides back into evening air. Curve meets curve, and nothing interrupts the joining. You feel the walls not as boundary, but as continuing shape that your own breathing completes. The city keeps moving without needing to arrive. Even your listening becomes weight that can rest on stone without leaving a mark behind. Sleep arrives. Fields, cattle, and the scent of damp earth. Leaving the stone walls behind, you step beyond the gate into open grassland where narrow earth paths unwind toward millet fields, maize plots, and wide grazing flats. Here the city's voice loosens and blends with the voice of soil itself. Low birds calling from shrubs, insects stirring under blades of grass, cattle answering one another across distance with slow, rounded calls. Cattle are not merely food here. They are measure, memory, and movement, shaping wealth and kinship as steadily as seasons shape the land. The morning air carries the scent of damp earth and trampled grass, and every sound seems to float longer before settling. The walls recede behind you without urgency, returning you to broader rhythm carried by wind. A small group of young herders guides the cattle outward with unhurried gestures, their voices low, sometimes breaking into quiet laughter over something only they understand. The animals move in an easy line, stopping often to pull at thick grass, their jaws rolling in slow certainty. No one urges them forward. The entire morning can pass inside this drifting exchange between step and bite and breath. Somewhere farther off, iron-tipped wooden tools open long furrows in red soil, each line drawn steadily without flourish. In lower fields, shallow water rests between raised earth, mirroring clouds that slide across its surface. The land accepts every movement without comment, holding sound and shape together in one continuous, patient layer of time itself. As the sun climbs higher, labor pauses beneath scattered trees, and workers settle into shade with simple food in their hands. Cooked millet, a little wild green, sometimes a touch of cooled sour milk, pass quietly between them. Their talk circles the weather, last season's harvest, the question of whether rains will arrive early or wait. These are not stories meant to be remembered, yet they hold the true weight of a civilization tied to soil, sky, and season. Here time is counted in moisture and seed, rather than in numbers. The earth listens to such conversations and answers gradually, not in promises, but in slow returns of grain and grass and steady nourishment for all who depend upon it. From this distance, when you turn to look back, great Zimbabwe rests within its hills, like a quiet gathering of stone shapes, rather than a rising proclamation. It does not soar like pyramids or cut the horizon with martial edges. Instead, its walls circle and fold into one another, echoing the curves of earth and sky. The architecture seems to belong to the land rather than command it. At midday, a handful of clouds soften the glare, drawing thin shadows that drift slowly across enclosure and field alike. The birds change register, their calls deepening with the cooling light. Cattle settle into their own stillness, chewing gently, eyes half closed, the world balanced between activity and rest without any signal. Afternoon stretches with little difference between one moment and the next. Heat eases and returns in slow waves that no one measures. The fields hold their color without insisting on brightness. Insects resume their thin metallic whispers beneath grass stems. Dust settles again on the backs of moving cattle. Somewhere a wooden cart creaks along a distant track, its sound arriving softened by space before dissolving. People drift back toward water and shade, not because a signal called them, but because the body prefers balance. Time here moves like the rotation of an unmarked wheel. Each small shift leads quietly into the next, without announcement, without conclusion, without need for naming the cycle, continuing with no edge and no center. Toward the later hours, light thins and spreads more widely across the plain. Clouds widen and dim the edges of things without removing their presence. Sound lowers rather than stops. The birds pause between calls. The cattle lie down in scattered arcs, chewing again what the morning collected. Their breathing becomes slower than walking, slower than speech. A single herder stands nearby without counting them, knowing their number by habit rather than sum. Nothing here insists on precision. The field accepts estimation and returns steadiness. Even the sun moves as if it were uncertain whether to linger or withdraw, and the land receives that hesitation without complaint, letting warmth and shadow intermingle without command over the wide red breathing soil. If you listen long enough, the scene begins to resemble many other countrysides held in memory. People, earth, food, and weather trading places in familiar sequence. The difference lies not in rhythm, but in the material that frames it. Here the enclosing stone loops back into view like a remembered shape, while elsewhere walls might be wood or mud or nothing at all. The pattern beneath remains unchanged. Sowing, tending, gathering, resting. The city of stone does not interrupt that circle, it echoes it. What rises from the field returns to the wall, and what rests within the wall moves outward again with the herds and the seed. Continuity needs no monument because the movement itself is the record remembered. At the height of rest, the field seems suspended between intentions. No work calls loudly, no voice gathers others with urgency. Even the insects soften their tempo, stretching each vibration into the air before letting it disappear. Shade thickens beneath trees, where dust rests on feet and cloth. A breeze shifts the tops of grasses without carrying news. You can feel the soil's faint coolness through the soles of your feet if you stand long enough. It is neither cold nor warm, only balanced. This balance settles into the body without instruction. The breath matches it. The heart loosens into its rhythm. What had felt like time becomes instead a wide, quiet surface across which nothing needs to travel quickly. When clouds thicken again and drift across the sun, a mild coolness returns to shoulders and earth alike. The shadows lose their edges and spread gently over furrows and grazing backs. A few herders rise from where they rested and begin gathering the cattle with low calls that travel farther than any shout. The herd answers in unison movement rather than sound. Hooves lift, pause, and place again with uncounted regularity. Dust stirs and settles. The path back toward the stone circles reforms without being drawn. Even from here, the walls appear not as boundary, but as a soft horizon of human presence, set against the larger horizon of hills, an open sky where evening will later quietly descend again. The midday passes without announcement and leaves no mark beyond the slight relocation of light. What remains is the familiar circle, field to herd, herd to wall, wall to rest. Nothing here seeks to rise above its place. Everything participates in what returns. The city of stone remains in view, not as fortress, but as folded ground given shape by patient hands. Around it, the land feeds and is fed by those who walk its paths. The cycle contains no beginning that can be pointed to and no ending that must be reached. It continues because it has learned how to continue. As long as breath meets soil and sound meets space and hands meet earth, the circle holds steady. Caravans that arrive and depart in slow quiet. When the sunlight begins its gentle tilt toward late afternoon, the roads leading outward from the stone city once again receive slow-moving lines of travelers. Great Zimbabwe does not live apart from the wider world. It breathes within it, quietly placed at the center of many distant paths. These paths link inland valleys rich with streams of gold and deep forests of ivory to the Swahili city-states along the Indian Ocean shore, and from there onward toward Arabia, India, and lands even farther away. Yet in this calm telling, the caravans do not represent conquest or urgency. They resemble drifting currents, entering and leaving as softly as weather patterns crossing a wide plain. From the eastern paths, a small group arrives carrying salt wrapped in bark fibers, finely woven cloth that folds like quiet water, and a handful of glass beads in pale blue and deep indigo. The beads are small, light, and cool to the touch, catching sunlight as if they were solid droplets of sky. Long after, archaeologists would uncover such beads beside fragments of Chinese ceramics and Arabic porcelain in the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, signs of the vast Indian Ocean trade network that once flowed through this stone city. But here, in this moment, they are simply objects of mild wonder resting in open hands. From the city itself, other materials prepare to leave. Gold washed from nearby streams and shallow mines, copper and iron shaped into bracelets and tools, and especially ivory from distant forest lands beyond the hills, all rest wrapped in animal hide. The leader of each caravan checks these bundles quietly, testing knots, smoothing edges, and adjusting weight with experienced hands. To those who pack these goods, They are not symbols of power, but items to be lifted, balanced, and carried without strain. The value lies not only in what they are, but in how carefully they must be moved. In the open courtyard, women and children gather around the unfamiliar objects arriving from far places. A glazed bowl catches the light, with a surface smoother than stone. A length of thin, patterned cloth hangs between two hands, like a soft reflection of water. The glass beads, bright and cool, rest briefly against fingers before being passed along. Small smiles appear and fade without excitement. Touch is gentle, curiosity quiet. These moments are not treated as events, only as brief exchanges of texture and color within an ordinary afternoon. The exchanges themselves unfold without raised voices. People sit, speak, and listen. They measure and agree, not as merchants in a marketplace, but as neighbors sharing time. When the decisions are finished, everyone eats together. Millet porridge steam rises softly from clay bowls. A little dried meat is shared, water passed hand to hand. Above them, the sun continues its silent movement across the sky. Below them, goods, stories, and small laughter drift between communities like threads woven into a soft, invisible network. As a caravan prepares to depart Great Zimbabwe, the shift is barely noticeable. Loads are lifted slowly, straps are tightened once more. The cattle stand patiently, their breath forming light clouds in the cooling air. When movement finally begins, footsteps soften with distance. Small bells tied at the cattle's necks ring faintly, then more faintly still, until the sound thins into the evening. The road empties behind them. Only dust remains under silver moonlight, and insects resume their wordless song. No one here believes they live within a great trading empire or economic center. Such ideas belong to distant languages and later histories. The people only know that sometimes others arrive, bringing bright, unfamiliar objects and strange accents. They know that these travelers leave again carrying gold, ivory, or grain. The coming and going become part of life in the same way as rain, arriving and departing within a single season. It is expected, accepted, and rarely named. As evening deepens, the courtyard returns to its quiet state. Children drift back to familiar doorways. Women gather the last bowls. The air cools. Somewhere along the outer paths, the caravan continues its slow progress beneath stars. Hooves press into soft earth. The pace remains unhurried, shaped by breath and distance rather than urgency. Along the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe, the city listens without listening, resting within its circular calm. Inside the enclosures, fires are lit again. Smoke folds upward without haste. The day releases its grip upon the ground. What has come is gone, leaving only mild traces of color and sound in memory. The city does not mark the departure of the caravan as loss. It accepts it as continuation. Trade here does not arrive like a wave and withdraw like a storm. It behaves instead like a tide that rises and falls, without disturbing the shoreline. Far beyond the walls, the caravan's figures grow smaller against field and sky. The landscape absorbs them without effort. The same soil that once carried them toward the city now carries them outward again. Dust lifts and settles. Insects retake their space in the grass. The road breathes, empty once more but never abandoned. Somewhere ahead, another settlement will receive them with equal quiet. After darkness fully arrives, Great Zimbabwe settles into its evening rhythm. No stories are told of long distances or distant seas. No maps unfold upon stone floors. Instead, people sleep, fires dim, and the walls hold the warmth of the day a little longer. In this slow-breathing city, even trade forgets itself as motion. What remains is not commerce, but continuity, moving gently back and forth across the land like a long, unwritten sentence that never truly ends. Inside the great enclosure. When afternoon descends, we return to the great enclosure, the broad elliptical wall that stands as the most recognizable form of Great Zimbabwe. Rising in some sections to nearly 10 meters, it gathers silence inside its curve, enclosing courtyards, passages, and the smooth, solid conical tower without door or chamber. In this hour, light arrives in long golden bands, and the world outside the walls grows distant, muted, reduced to a softened echo of motion and sound. The air cools quietly, and dust settles with visible patience, while faint footsteps pass like breaths across earth that has learned the memory of countless nights and countless returns of shade, shadow, and human presence within the same curved stone embrace of time. Within the enclosure, the afternoon light moves slowly, tracing patterns along every stone. Each step across the packed earth sounds softer than expected, as if the ground itself has learned to listen. Scholars of later centuries would suggest that this space once belonged to elites, to private rights, or to guarded authority. Yet in this quiet telling, the space makes no claims. It only opens itself as a chamber where ordinary moments grow larger, precisely because nothing competes with them for attention. The wind passes overhead, carrying distant bird calls that touch the interior air and then release it again, while the warmth held inside the stones drifts outward at a pace slow enough for the body to forget urgency. A young woman sits near the wall, weaving a basket from pale plant fibers. Her hands repeat a language older than instruction, over and over under the settling light. She does not hurry, because the day itself does not hurry. Above her, birds cross the open sky, and their shadows slip briefly across the stone before drifting on. The basket grows quietly, ring by ring, soundlessly shaping itself into something that will later hold grain, water, or small gathered things. The rhythm of her work blends with distant footfalls outside the enclosure until motion becomes a single gentle current of human activity, steady, unremarkable, and sufficient for this hour of slowly folding light where presence matters more than any destination. Not far away, a small boy holds a drum against his knees, tapping with careful gentleness. He is not calling anyone and not announcing anything. He listens to the way the sound returns from the stone, how it softens, how it lingers, how it fades. His rhythm is not for ceremony, not for command, only for curiosity, for the simple pleasure of hearing space. Answer a question that was never spoken aloud. The drum becomes a bridge rather than a signal, a soft link between moving hands and unchanging walls, between momentary breath and enduring stone, between a child testing sound and a structure that receives everything without reply as evening gathers and the floor of the sky deepens slowly. An elderly man walks slowly along the inner curve of the wall, letting his hand glide across the stone without thought, as if greeting something both familiar and lasting. His fingers follow the subtle shifts in texture, the warmth stored from the day, the fine dust that settles and lifts again with each passing step. There is no reverence in the gesture, only recognition, like touching the trunk of a tree that has stood across generations. The wall does not answer, but it does not withdraw either. It holds the heat of sunlight and the shadow of evening with equal calm, offering no explanation and no refusal, only the patience of wait and quiet endurance that stretches beyond name's beginnings. The conical tower stands at the center, smooth and sealed without opening or interior explanation. Its surface receives the last sunlight as a single continuous plane of warmth. No door invites entry, no chamber suggests storage, no sign directs meaning. For this hour it is only a vertical presence, holding shadow at its base and birds at its narrow crown as they pass without landing. Whatever purpose it once held, whether symbolic, practical, or quietly functional, has softened with time into stillness, and the people who move near it no longer ask what it was, but accept what it has become. In the lowering light, it behaves less like an answer and more like a question demand to be solved. If you lie down at the center of the enclosure and look upward, the rim of stone rises around the sky like the lip of a vast well. Yet this well does not draw you downward. It cradles the open blue above, holding your gaze in place for longer than you planned. The clouds drift more slowly, framed by the curve, and the birds pass like measured punctuation across the page of light. Your breath begins to follow the same unhurried metric, expanding, pausing, releasing, as the enclosure lends you its own sense of circular time, without edges, without urgency, without insistence. The weight of day settles gently into limbs, and thought becomes softer, rounder, less demanding of direction onward. In this place, no heavy mystery presses upon the air, and no urgent explanation crowds the senses. The stones stand without insisting on interpretation, and the people move without performing significance. What exists here is the quiet work of ordinary presence, a meal unfolding, a voice rising and falling, a breeze arriving slightly stronger than expected and departing again. Time becomes visible in subtle transitions and shade, in the way sound thins and thickens, and how light gathers along the wall before slipping away and leaving behind only temperature and faint memory. The enclosure does not reveal its past in stories, but offers its present in steady layers of sensation that require nothing more than attention from the listening body. As the afternoon leans toward evening, a small gathering forms without intention. People pass through the enclosure and linger briefly, exchanging a few words, sharing water, adjusting garments, counting nothing in particular. The sunlight withdraws from the highest stones, first leaving the lower curves, glowing with the last held warmth, and above the sky deepens into layered blue. Footsteps soften further, as if the earth itself were becoming more yielding with the loss of heat. Shadows lengthen, blend, and finally dissolve into one another until form gives way to tone and tone to rest. The enclosure remains awake, yet unwatchful, holding everything without selecting, without correcting, without shaping the moment into something other than itself, as the evening completes itself. When darkness finally enters the great enclosure, it does so without announcement. The sky dims at the rim, the birds vanish into absent sound, and the last warmth releases its hold on the stones. The people drift outward, carrying with them the soft residue of the day, and what remains inside the walls is not emptiness but a gathered quiet. The conical tower loses its definition and becomes only a darker shade of night. The walls blend into the sky, and the enclosure turns into a container, not of structure, but of stillness, where even memory slows and breath finds its own uncounted pace. In this held darkness, the great enclosure does not end the day it completes it softly. The seasons passing through stone. Time at Great Zimbabwe was not measured by clocks or by numbered days, but by the slow turning of seasons that returned again and again with steady patience. The rhythm of life was shaped by rain and dryness, by planting and gathering, by the steady breathing of the sky and the earth together. When the rainy season arrived, water fell heavily upon the granite hills, sliding along the stone walls in darkening trails. The steps grew wet and glossy, and every surface deepened in color, as if the city were quietly absorbing the sky. Puddles formed in shallow pockets of stone, mirroring the low gray clouds above, and children stirred the water with their hands until gentle ripples loosened the reflected world. During these weeks, grass spread thick and soft around the walls, turning the valley into a wide green cloth laid patiently across the land. The air carried the scent of wet earth and new growth. Cattle moved more slowly, their hooves pressing dark marks into the softened ground, and their breath rose faintly in the humid air. Smoke from hearth fires drifted low and blue, blending with the mist that clung to the slopes at dawn. Nothing hurried. Even the rain seemed to know it had all the time it needed to fall, pause, and fall again without ever demanding attention. When the dry season returned, the land shifted into pale gold and quiet dust. The grass thinned, the earth grew firm again beneath bare feet, and the walls took on a warmer tone as fine grains settled into their seams. At night, the sky cleared completely, and the stars felt nearer, pressing their light closer to the sleeping city. The stone walls became pale lines drawn carefully between deep shadows and open sky. Fires burned lower, and voices carried farther in the cool, transparent air. The city rested differently in dryness than it did in rain, but it rested just the same. The walls themselves did not change, yet everything surrounding them continuously changed its clothing. Some days were filled with the faint, drifting scent of burned grass from distant fields, a dry sweetness in the air. Other days carried the thick smell of first rain after long heat, when dust gave way to dampness, and the world seemed to breathe in relief. The cattle herds expanded and thinned as seasons passed, and the maize fields moved from fullness to emptiness and back again without announcement. What endured was not abundance or lack, but the certainty that each would arrive in its turn. In this quiet telling, the city knew no loud turning points, no sudden upheavals that demanded retelling. Change arrived slowly in small gestures. A new roof added to an old house, a courtyard widened by a careful line of stones, a footpath smoothed by the steady passing of many feet. People aged without ceremony. Children grew without notice, and the walls accepted each passing generation without comment. Even memory flowed at the pace of weather rather than at the speed of stories. You can imagine yourself sitting beside one of these walls, your back warmed by stone that has held the sun all day. Each time you close your eyes and open them again, another season has quietly passed. Rain darkens the stone, then sunlight dries it once more. Grass rises and falls. The air cools, then softens with warmth again. The wall remains where it has always been, yet between its stones, new roots thread their way inward, small insects trace hidden paths, and the marks of living continue to press gently into its surface. With time, all of Great Zimbabwe becomes a vast and silent timekeeper, but one that moves at a pace too slow for urgency. The angle of shadow along the walls, the shifting color of the grass, the changing weight of humidity in the air, all measure passing days without ever naming them. Nothing calls attention to the hours. Instead, the city exists as a long, uninterrupted breath, taken and released across decades without strain. Morning does not compete with evening. One season does not push the other aside. They follow. Even the people begin to feel like part of this wider turning rather than separate from it. Their routines adjust gently without planning. In wet months, they walk with care upon the softened earth. In dry months, they rise earlier to meet the clearer light. Their hands remember different textures at different times of year: damp soil, brittle stalks, smooth stone warmed by long sun. Their voices follow the same soft pattern, never rising far above the work that holds their days together. From a distance, Great Zimbabwe might appear unchanged year after year, yet within its stillness the world is always quietly rearranging itself. No two mornings share the same light. No two evenings carry identical air. Clouds shape themselves differently above the hill each day. Even the wind learns new paths between the stones, as seasons loosen and tighten their invisible threads around the city. The walls do not resist these changes. They receive them without interruption. Over many years, the slow cycles leave delicate signatures behind. Tiny plants establish themselves in narrow seams. Dust gathers, is washed away, and gathers again. Stone edges soften just enough that hands sliding across them feel a difference without needing to name it. The city never grows old in the way a single life grows old. It simply deepens, adding layers too subtle to count, yet too present to deny. Time here does not pass away. It accumulates. If you remain by the wall long enough, even thought begins to follow the pattern of seasons rather than the pattern of minutes. Worries arrive and fade like clouds. Attention settles, lifts, and settles again. The slow certainty of repetition replaces the desire for progress. Rain will come. Dryness will follow. Fields will empty and fill again. The stone will continue to stand. Nothing requires haste when everything already knows how to return. As twilight enters another evening, the city prepares itself for night as it has always done, without announcement and without resistance. The cattle draw closer to shelter. Fires are fed one last time. The sky cools and the walls release the warmth they gathered during the day. Somewhere a voice drifts briefly through the fading light, then disappears into the steady breathing of earth and sky. The seasons continue their work unseen, and Great Zimbabwe rests within their endless turning, measuring time not by what changes quickly, but by what changes gently. Stonebirds and the Evening Stories. Among the most quiet and mysterious shapes left behind at Great Zimbabwe are the stone birds carved from soft soapstone, simple in form yet deep in presence. They stand without wings in motion, without calls in their throats, and yet they seem to watch more than anything else in the city. In this drifting sleep story, evening arrives gently after the final bowl of food has been shared, and after the fires have softened into warm red circles that breathe more than they burn. Children gather close to an elder who still has enough patience to tell slow stories and enough memory to let the past rise without effort. The city settles into listening, even the stones. He points toward the low platform where a small stone bird rests in the firelight shadow, and says with a mild smile that the bird has watched the city longer than anyone alive remembers. Perhaps it has heard every story that ever drifted through these walls. The children stare at the quiet figure and imagine that during the day it stands perfectly still, but at night it learns how to fly inside dreams. They picture it hopping softly along the tops of walls, glancing into each courtyard to see what small happiness happened that day, returning before morning to stand again, like carved silence. Their thoughts wander without effort as the firelight rises and falls. The elder begins telling stories in a calm, unhurried voice, not of battles or storms, but of seasons that arrived gently. He tells of a year when the rains came early and grain grew taller than expected. Of another when the cattle gave birth to more calves than anyone could count at once. He tells of a night when traders arrived with a single bowl so bright with glaze that everyone touched it in turn just to be sure it was real. The children listen without leaning forward and without pulling away, held in the middle space where nothing needs to become important to remain meaningful. Wind moves through the fire and causes the shadows of stone walls to shift and dance softly across the ground. The dark shapes look like animals moving slowly past the hearth, not in fear or in hunger, only in search of places to lie down and sleep. The motion never startles anyone. It becomes part of the evening rhythm, like breath, moving in and out of the body. Somewhere a child yawns and is not embarrassed for it. Somewhere another rests their head against a shoulder without comment. The city grows smaller and warmer around the circle. Inside the modest stone and earth room, the sound of the elder's voice and the sound of the wind meet and blend. One does not try to overpower the other. The voice carries memory, the wind carries night. Together they weave a single fabric that wraps softly around the room. The stone birds, whether truly listening or only imagined to be listening, remain silent witnesses. They have always listened in this story. They listen to laughter that fades quickly, to stories that arrive slowly, to the long breathing of a city that does not hurry itself, even at the edge of centuries. The children begin to imagine that the birds remember things people have forgotten, like the exact sound of the first stone being placed on another stone, or the way the valley looked before any wall existed. They imagine that the birds remember every person who ever leaned their back against the wall and closed their eyes in the sun. These thoughts make the room feel larger without becoming louder. The children do not need proof. The idea itself is enough to let their minds soften further into the evening. Outside, the stars spread quietly across the sky above the hill and the valley. Inside, the fire settles lower without being fed. Someone shifts a log only once more, then lets it remain where it rests. The elder's voice grows slower as the stories begin to repeat themselves in gentle cycles, like seasons told in words instead of weather. One child drifts into sleep before realizing it has happened. Another resists only for a moment longer, then slips quietly into the same unmarked rest. You, the listener who exists in a time very far from this room, are listening too. You are not listening to remember details, not listening to collect names or dates, but only to feel that in one quiet place in Africa, there were evenings that passed in this way. Evenings filled with fire that did not need tending, with stories that did not need endings, with children who did not need to be told when to sleep. The sound of the wind traveling across stone becomes enough. The elder finishes one final thought without turning it into a conclusion, saying only that the stone bird will keep listening after everyone has gone to sleep. The children accept this easily, as children do. The city accepts it as well. Silence enters the room without closing any doors. Breathing deepens. The fire slips into a red whisper. Outside, the wind continues to move across the walls and across the valley, without direction and without purpose. In that quiet, the city becomes a single resting body. The stone birds remain exactly where they have always been. If they dream, no one sees it. If they do not, no one needs them to. Night passes as it always does, not quickly and not slowly, only forward. The walls hold warmth a little longer. The sky changes without asking for attention. The fire becomes ash without complaint. And still the stories remain, not as spoken words anymore, but as a feeling left behind in the air, where the voice once moved. The valley listens, the hill listens, the small stone birds listen. The listener far away listens. Nothing is required to happen next. The city does not wait for anything. It simply remains, allowing night to pass through it the same way seasons and centuries always have. When the city gently fades. When the waking world speaks of great Zimbabwe, it often speaks of decline, of roots shifting and resources thinning, of walls left behind by leaving feet. But in this sleep version, the city does not fall. It simply drifts, easing from fullness into quiet the way evening eases from gold into gray. One morning arrives like all the others, with light on stone and wind in grass. Yet somewhere within the slow rhythm, a single family begins to feel the pull of another horizon. Nothing is broken. Nothing is chased away. The feeling is only the grass may be thicker elsewhere, water closer, paths a little wider for the cattle that breathe beside them under the same patient sky tonight. They pack slowly, not as if ending a chapter, but as if turning a page that is already halfway turned by time itself. Baskets are lifted, hides folded, grain poured from one container into another with quiet hands that have performed the same motions for years. The stone doorway waits without comment as the family moves through it one last time. Cattle stepping carefully behind them. Bells giving a soft goodbye that sounds very much like every other morning sound. There is no ceremony, only direction, and even direction feels gentle here. The wall does not resist their leaving. The path does not urge them on. The valley holds their footprints briefly, then releases them as dust settles behind slowly. After some time, another household feels the same quiet tug, then another, not in a chain of loss, but in a soft widening of distance between what remains and what once filled every corner with sound. Courtyards still glow at night, but with fewer fires. Shadows still move across stone, but with fewer voices to cast them. The walls remain exactly where they have always been, patient in their long watching, as leaves begin to gather, where feet once passed daily. Without hands to sweep them away, the leaves become a thin season of their own, rustling softly at the base of curved stone, like a new form of conversation, answered only by wind and distant birds, passing through evening. Without regular touch, a small section of wall shifts one season, only a few stones slipping inward, with a sound so quiet it might be mistaken for settling breath. No one rushes to repair it. The stones do not hurry either. They simply rest again in a slightly different arrangement and accept the pause that follows. Grass begins to search for the narrow spaces between them, roots feeling their way through shadow and mineral until fragile green threads appear where once only gray lived. Birds arrive that are not carved, landing beside those that are, and leave again without ceremony, carrying seeds, carrying breath, carrying the small instructions of life that tell the valley. It continues without asking anyone why. Evenings grow thinner inside the enclosure as fewer fires answer the coming dark. The great curved wall gathers more wind than warmth now, holding it in its stone arms and letting it pass through with a cooler voice. Footpaths soften, their clear edges blurred beneath dust and falling seed. The city does not vanish. It thins the way mist thins at dawn, slowly enough that memory keeps insisting it is still fully there. Someone returning after many seasons would not say it disappeared. They would only say it feels farther away than it once did, as if a familiar face were now being seen across water instead of across a yard, where voices once crossed without effort or distance easily. In this quiet thinning, the city falls into a long sleep, so deep it resembles forgetting without becoming absence. Centuries later, when distant travelers arrive and stand before the great curved walls, they do not hear echoes of voices, but they sense that voices have been here. The shape of the place teaches them how to listen slowly. They touch the stone with careful hands and feel not answers, but patience. The city does not explain itself to newcomers. It only remains, letting curiosity wear gentle paths into questions that may never be finished asking. Great Zimbabwe becomes something between presence and memory, awake enough to be seen, asleep enough to be approached quietly by those who breathe slowly nearby. For the stones themselves, nothing truly ends. They do not mark centuries. They only remain in contact with sun and rain, warmth and cooling, growth and settling. They continue standing beside one another because they always have, not because they are remembered. Roots work their patient lines between them. Insects borrow the shadows at their base. Heat fills them by day. Coolness empties them by night. If abandonment exists, the stones do not call it that. They only call it another arrangement of silence. Their closeness does not change. Their patience does not break. Their listening does not require voices anymore to feel complete. Only the soft wind and the long passing of uncounted evenings measure their shared time now. In this sleep version, there is no final emptiness where the city once stood. There is only space slowly learning a new way to hold itself. Walls hold wind, courtyards hold seed and shadow. Pathways hold memory and dust, so light it lifts with a passerby's breath. Even disappearance becomes a form of remaining when it moves carefully enough. Great Zimbabwe does not collapse into ruin, it exhales into landscape. Hills receive it, grass receives it. The sky receives it each night as it always has, without naming what is given. The city becomes something that does not need watching anymore, because it has learned how to be held within the slow breathing of seasons that come without announcement now. If you imagine yourself standing at the edge of the enclosure long after the last hearth has cooled, you do not feel that you have arrived too late. You feel only that you have arrived at a different chapter of the same long sentence. The stone still curves the sky into a bowl. The wind still carries its careful tone through narrow passages. Night still gathers gently in the open spaces. Nothing reaches forward with urgency. Nothing pulls backward with regret. The city has not gone anywhere. It has only stepped slightly to one side of time where it can rest without needing to be explained, while the long conversation between stone, grass, and sky continues without needing witnesses again. And in this last hour of the slow journey, nothing asks to be resolved. Families have gone where grass called them. Walls have stayed where stone placed them. Birds have come and gone without needing to take the city with them. What remains is neither triumph nor loss, only continuity softened into rest. Great Zimbabwe does not end. It fades in the same way breath fades when sleep finally deepens, still present, still warm, simply quieter. And in that quiet, the city becomes wide enough to hold both what it was and what it no longer needs to be, without tension, without demand, without the weight of any final meaning, as night lowers its calm hand over stone and memory. The lullaby of the great stone houses. Now we return gently to the present moment, carrying the long quiet of stone and seasons back with us as softly as breath. You may imagine yourself as a silent visitor walking among the ruins of great Zimbabwe today, where the walls still stand, the grass grows taller, the trees spread wider, and the sky remains as boundless as it ever was. There is no smoke rising now, no grinding of grain, no lowing of cattle, yet if you remain still long enough, something very small continues to move beneath the silence, a rhythm that comes from stone, from wind, and from the quiet work of your own imagination, listening. Scholars speak of this place as the center of a vast kingdom once stretching across tens of thousands of square kilometers, tied to trade routes reaching the Indian Ocean and beyond, a powerful testament to African urban and architectural achievement before the colonial age. Yet for these final minutes of rest, we do not need to hold tightly to such immense frames. We only need to remember the smallest pieces that shaped a living world here, the quiet gestures that built meaning without needing to name it, the daily movements that never imagined they would become echoes carried across centuries. You may remember a morning that opened with the sound of cattle breathing in the cool air and the gentle rhythm of grain being ground for porridge. You may remember the stoneworker tapping a chosen rock and listening patiently for its voice. You may remember a child running through curved corridors, hand brushing stone, feet lifting dust. You may remember a late afternoon when sunlight slid slowly across the great enclosure and softened the weight of the walls. You may remember an evening when a carved bird of stone stood quietly near a fire, listening without sound to stories told without hurry. These fragments are enough to make great Zimbabwe a gentle place within the mind, a great stone palace of Africa, not designed for loud celebration, but for reminding us that civilizations can grow within slow rhythms of planting, building, herding, trading, telling stories, and watching seasons pass along the curve of stone. Nothing in this world needed to be rushed to become meaningful. Time itself moved as a companion, not as a master, resting easily in each repeated gesture that shaped both wall and memory with equal patience. As you lie down now, you may imagine leaning your back against a cool stone wall and lifting your eyes toward the open sky. Your breathing slows as if matching a deeper clock hidden beneath the surface of things. Each inhale feels wider, each exhale longer. The night does not arrive suddenly. It unfolds the way shadow once unfolded through the corridors of the enclosure, slowly, carefully, without disturbing what already rests. Nothing presses forward. Nothing pulls behind. The present becomes wide enough to hold both imagination and sleep without effort. Great Zimbabwe does not speak loudly across time. It whispers through stone and wind and the quiet persistence of curved walls that learn to outlast voices without forgetting them. Its language is not carried by words but by shapes, by temperature, by the way light gathers and releases itself along rock that has known countless days and nights. In this whisper there is no demand. There is only invitation, the gentle permission to rest within something older than urgency and wider than thought. The ruins you walk through in your mind are not empty. They are full of slowed movement and layered breath. They hold the residue of footsteps that learned how to pass without leaving wounds. They hold the warmth that stone gathered during long vanished afternoons. They hold the cool that stone offered when nights softened fire. Even without names, even without stories spoken aloud, the place continues to do what it has always done. Hold space for quiet continuity where nothing insists on being finished. Stone curves still guide the sky into rounded stillness. Grass still searches for light between shadows. Wind still learns the shape of the walls as it passes through them. Birds still arrive and depart without ceremony. Nothing requires explanation anymore. Everything moves with the long memory of motion that does not need narration. Great Zimbabwe now exists, not as event, but as presence, not as evidence, but as atmosphere, not as monument, but as rhythm, waiting patiently within the listener. If you remain with the image long enough, the ruins begin to feel less like history and more like a breathing shape within the dark. Every wall seems to rise and fall with your chest. Every path seems to soften beneath your step. Even the sky above appears wider, as if the slowing of thought itself has expanded it. In this space, sleep does not arrive as an ending. It arrives as a continuation of the same slow movements that shaped stone and season alike. You do not need to hold Great Zimbabwe in your mind with effort anymore. It carries itself now. Just as stone once learned how to carry sky, and oxen learned how to carry load, and hands learned how to carry grain and tools and fire, your attention may now set its burden down. Nothing here asks to be remembered precisely. Everything asks only to be felt, gently, and then released into rest. And so the story closes not with finality, but with quiet coverage, like night sliding across the great stone houses once again. The curves disappear slowly into shadow. The grass sighs as wind settles. The stars hold still above walls that no longer measure time. In this soft enclosure of breath and darkness, the last image fades without being lost. Sleep arrives as calmly as the ancient city once breathed, and the world, for now, rests. A message returned to the stone walls. And then, as the story gently reaches its resting place, Great Zimbabwe remains exactly where it has always been, quiet among stone hills and tall grasses, as it has rested for centuries without needing witness or explanation. By day the walls gather sunlight into their patient curves. By night they return a trace of that warmth to the air. No footsteps cross the courtyards now. No hearth smoke drifts above the rounded roofs. Yet the wind still finds its way through ancient passages, practicing the same slow roots, learned long ago that continue shaping silence, long after voices disappear now. The stars still arrive at their familiar places above the hill, patient and unhurried, while grass continues to rise from the smallest seams in stone, as if life never truly left, only changed how it shows itself. Great Zimbabwe does not need to be named with large numbers measured by borders or elevated by titles of power. In this gentle sleep, it is simply a place where people once lived, where fire once glowed, where children once ran across open ground, and where afternoon light once slid slowly down the faces of stone, holding ordinary life like breath within memory. These great stone houses do not carry the weight of ruin, but the softness of transition. People came and went, seasons arrived and departed, voices thinned into quiet, and fire settled back into darkness. Yet the ground learned how to remember in gentler ways than sound. Leaves gathered where sweeping once happened. Grass threaded into cracks where hands once repaired. Birds settled beside stone figures and lifted away again. Nothing ended sharply here. Everything simply leaned into stillness, the way evening leans into night without needing permission or resistance, as the last warmth of day loosens from stone slowly now. If your eyes are closed now, you may imagine yourself seated at the edge of an old wall, your palm resting on its cool surface. There's nothing to recall and nothing to prepare. The wind moves past your shoulder, your breath moves within your chest, and both find an easy agreement with the slower breathing of the land. Great Zimbabwe does not sing you to sleep with words. It sings with the endurance of silence, with time moving just a little slower than the heart's own steady beat. And in that slowing, every remaining tension loosens without struggle now. Now you may allow sleep to arrive, as it always has here, without urgency and without sound. Let it come the way darkness once spread across the great stone houses, gently covering curves and corridors, grass and shadow, dust and memory. Nothing needs to be held anymore. Nothing needs to be followed. The story remains behind you like warmth in cooled stone, and the night moves forward without asking for effort. Very slowly, very lightly, and very peacefully. The breath deepens, the body softens, the mind releases its last gentle grip, and rest settles like dust on stone at last.